"I'm not your type. I'll leave at dawn," the cook said, until the Duke begged her to stay. The wind howled across the frozen plains of Urindor, carrying with it a chill that seemed to cut through the heart of anyone who dared walk the long roads toward the northern fortress. The fortress of Duke Darien Valemont rose like a dark crown atop the cliffs, its tall towers piercing the low-hanging clouds. Rumors of curses, lost heirs, and shadows that moved on their own had spread across villages for generations. Yet despite the danger, a young woman named Lyra pressed forward, her small satchel swinging at her side. Lyra was not a traveler of noble birth. Her hands were calloused from years of kneading dough and chopping vegetables. Her eyes, however, were sharp, and her spirit sharper still. She had heard whispers of work at the Duke's fortress, work as a cook, but she also knew the risk. The Valemont family had a reputation for harboring sorrow as easily as royalty. Yet the cold winds and the promise of a job outweighed her fear. As she approached the massive gates, two guards stepped forward, their armor gleaming despite the frost. "State your name and business," one said, his voice deep, echoing against the stone walls. "I am Lyra," she replied steadily. "I seek work as a cook in the Duke's kitchens." The guards exchanged a glance. One raised an eyebrow. "The Duke rarely hires from outside, especially not someone like you." Lyra squared her shoulders. "I am fast, precise, and I cook better than most. I only ask for a chance." There was a long silence, broken only by the whistling wind. Then, with a nod, the guard stepped aside. "Very well, but be warned, you enter at your own risk." Lyra stepped through the gates, and the fortress seemed to swallow her whole. Inside, the stone corridors were cold, echoing with the footsteps of unseen inhabitants. Torches flickered in the walls, casting long, dancing shadows. She shivered, not entirely from the cold. There was something alive in the fortress, something that watched from the corners, quiet and patient. She was led to the kitchens, a vast room filled with the scent of herbs, spices, and the lingering smoke of wood fires. Copper's pots hung in orderly rows, and polished knives gleamed under the torchlight. A few assistants moved quickly, chopping, stirring, and tasting, their eyes flicking at her warily. At the center of the room stood a man. Tall, with hair as dark as midnight and eyes that seemed to pierce through walls, he looked every bit the Duke. His expression was unreadable, yet it carried the weight of centuries. "You must be Lyra," he said, his voice low and smooth, like velvet draped over steel. "I am Duke Darien Valemont. You may stay if your hands are as skilled as your courage." Lyra bowed slightly. "I will do my best, my lord." Darien studied her for a moment longer, and for the first time Lyra felt a flicker of unease. It was not fear, it was something stranger, curiosity, caution, and a quiet hunger for what she might bring. The first days passed with hard work. Lyra moved through the kitchens like a shadow, chopping, stirring, and preparing meals that were both humble and exquisite. She learned the rules of the fortress quickly. Never question the Duke's commands, keep your head down, and never speak of the shadows. For there were whispers of shadows, of figures that moved on their own, of voices that spoke when no one was near. Lyra had not seen them yet, but she felt their presence, a chill that wrapped around her heart when she walked alone in the corridors at night. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon and the sky bled shades of purple and crimson, a sudden alarm rang through the fortress. It was a soft, melodic chime, but it carried urgency. Lyra's heart pounded as she rushed to the kitchens, only to find Darien standing at the doorway, his cloak billowing in the wind. "Something stirs in the halls," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I feel it." Lyra looked around. The kitchens were empty except for them. The shadows from the torches stretched unnaturally along the walls as if they were alive. "Is it dangerous?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Darien shook his head. "I do not know. But it is drawn to weakness. It seeks fear." Lyra swallowed hard, her hands trembling. She had always believed that courage was enough to keep one safe, but here, In the presence of the Duke and the shadows that seemed to move just beyond sight, courage felt fragile. That night she slept little. The room assigned to her overlooked the cliff, and the wind that tore across the rocks carried a strange, mournful sound, almost like crying. Her thoughts drifted to the stories she had heard of the Duke, how he had lost many to the curse that haunted his family, how his heart had been locked away for fear of more loss. She could not help but feel a pang of sympathy, and yet a strange fascination as well. The next morning, Darian entered the kitchen before dawn. He watched silently as Lyra prepared the day's bread, kneading the dough with steady hands. She caught his gaze and felt a shiver run down her spine, not from fear, but from the intensity of being seen. "You move with purpose," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "Most would falter under these walls." Lyra glanced down. "I do not falter easily." Darian stepped closer, studying her as if trying to read her very thoughts. "You are not like the others," he said. "And that is troubling." Lyra paused, wiping flour from her hands. "I am not your type, my lord," she said quietly, almost as if testing the words herself. "I will leave at dawn if I am a burden." For a moment the Duke did not respond. Then he smiled, a rare thing fleeting like a shadow passing over a moonlit lake. "Perhaps," he said, his voice low, "I will beg you to stay before dawn comes." The days that followed were filled with quiet tension. Lyra worked diligently, earning the respect of the kitchen staff and the cautious attention of the Duke. Darian, in turn, seemed to be testing her boundaries, observing her reactions, pushing her with subtle tasks and challenges. She found herself both annoyed and intrigued by the attention, a strange warmth growing in her chest that she could not name. One night, as a silver moon rose over the fortress, Lyra was fetching herbs from the cellar when she felt a sudden movement behind her. A shadow slipped along the wall faster than her eyes could follow. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. A soft chuckle replied, echoing off the stone walls. "Fear not, I am no enemy." Lyra turned and saw Darian stepping out of the darkness, his cloak brushing the floor. "The shadows do not harm those who are careful," he said, his eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight. "But they test everyone who enters these halls." Lyra's hands trembled slightly. "And you are not afraid," Darian's gaze was steady. "I have learned to live with it, but perhaps it is time someone else walks beside me unafraid." For the first time, Lyra saw a vulnerability in him, a crack in the armor of the Duke that few had seen. And in that moment, she felt something stir within herself. A desire to stay, to see beyond the shadows, to reach the heart of the man who had been cursed by fate and solitude. Yet she reminded herself of her promise, to leave at dawn if she was not wanted, to not entangle herself in the dangers of this fortress. And still, as she returned to her room that night, her thoughts lingered on the Duke, on his silent strength, his quiet sadness, and the strange pull she could not resist. The first week passed, and with it, the fortress seemed to grow more alive. Shadows twisted in the torchlight, whispers echoed through empty halls, and Lyra found herself walking the line between fear and fascination. She learned the quiet language of the Duke, the way he moved, the way he spoke in half-truths, and the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching. On the seventh night, a storm began to roll in from the north. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the fortress in brief, blinding flashes. Lyra, standing at the window of the kitchen, watched the wind tear across the cliffs. A sense of foreboding settled over her, heavier than the cold. Darian appeared behind her, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "The storm is not the only danger tonight," he murmured, "but I am glad you are here, Lyra, more than I expected to be." Her heart skipped a beat. I will do my best," she whispered. He turned to look at her fully, the lightning illuminating his sharp features. "I do not ask for your best, I ask for your presence, and perhaps your trust." Lyra swallowed, knowing that what she felt was no longer simple duty. Something deeper, more complicated, had begun to take root. As the storm raged outside, the shadows in the fortress seemed to gather closer, as if aware of the bond forming in the warmth of the kitchen. Lyra's hands trembled not from the cold, but from the uncertain, thrilling fear of the days to come. She had promised to leave at dawn. Yet for the first time she wondered, could she really? The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the fortress wrapped in a cold, silver mist. The wind whispered through the stone towers, carrying the scent of damp earth and frost. Lyra moved through the corridors quietly, her footsteps echoing softly against the walls. Though the storm had ended, the air still felt heavy, almost alive, as if the fortress itself held its breath. Lyra had not left at dawn, though she had promised herself she would. Something in the fortress, something in the Duke, had made her stay. She tried to deny it, telling herself it was curiosity, responsibility, or simple stubbornness. Yet the truth was more complicated. She felt drawn to Darien in ways she could not name, a pull that was both frightening and thrilling. The kitchen was busier than usual that morning. A traveling party of nobles was to arrive at noon, and the Duke had ordered a feast worthy of their station. Lyra moved efficiently, chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, and kneading dough with precision. The other kitchen staff had begun to accept her presence, though whispers followed her as she worked. Some admired her skill, others were wary of the new cook who seemed unafraid of the shadows in the fortress. Darien entered silently, his long coat brushing the floor. He leaned against the doorframe, observing her as she worked. There was a weight in his gaze that made her pause just for a moment before she turned back to her tasks. "You work quickly," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "But do you notice the details or only the speed?" Lyra wiped her hands on her apron. "I notice everything, my lord. The small things matter most." He stepped closer, tilting his head. "Do they?" he asked. "Even shadows, even whispers in empty halls?" Lyra hesitated, sensing the meaning beneath his words. "I notice them, but I do not fear them." Darien's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Fear is what the shadows feed on." The morning passed in a flurry of activity. As the cooks and assistants prepared the feast, Lyra caught herself stealing glances at the Duke. He moved through the kitchen like a shadow of his own, tall and precise, yet something in his eyes seemed restless, burdened by thoughts that no one else could see. She wondered about the stories she had heard, the losses, the family curse, the mysterious tragedies that had touched the Vailmonts for generations. After the preparations were done, Darien led her to a small chamber near the kitchens. The room was dimly lit, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, candles, and ancient tomes. In the center stood a large mirror framed in black wood, its surface slightly clouded as though it had absorbed centuries of secrets. "This is where I keep my records," Darien said quietly, "things that are not meant for the eyes of the ordinary world." Lyra's curiosity rose, but she remained respectful. "Records of what, my lord?" He gestured to the mirror. "The past and the future. My family's mistakes, our losses, the curse that has followed us. I have learned to watch it, to prepare for it, but I have never allowed anyone else to see." Lyra stepped closer, mesmerized by the cloudy surface. She did not know what she expected to see, ghosts perhaps or visions, but the mirror remained still, reflecting only the two of them. "Why show me this?" she asked softly. Darien's gaze met hers. "Because I am testing you. Because I want to see if you are like the others, or if you might stand by me when the shadows come." Lyra swallowed. She did not know what the Duke expected of her, but something deep inside her stirred. She wanted to prove herself, not just with skill in the kitchen, but in courage, in presence, in heart. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between them grew, subtle but undeniable. Lyra learned the rhythms of the fortress, the quiet patterns, the hidden corridors, the way the shadows seemed to shift in Darien's presence. She noticed how he would linger in the kitchen doorway when he thought she wasn't watching, or how his hand would brush a parchment on his desk, as if hesitating before opening it. One evening, Darian asked her to accompany him on a walk through the northern gardens. The gardens were a frozen maze of hedges, their branches heavy with frost. The moonlight glinted off the ice, casting everything in a pale, silver glow. "It is quiet here," Lyra said, breathing in the crisp air. "Almost like the world is holding its breath." Darian nodded. "The gardens are the only place in the fortress where I can think without shadows pressing too close, but even here they linger." Lyra glanced at him, curiosity mingling with caution. "Do the shadows frighten you?" For a moment, Darian did not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low. "They do not frighten me, not in the way most people fear, but they remind me of what I have lost, of the walls I have built around my heart." Lyra felt a pang of sympathy. "And do you regret those walls?" He looked away, toward the moonlit hedges. "I regret that they kept out warmth as well as danger. I regret that I have lived so long without someone to share the silence with." Her heart quickened, and she realized how fragile the Duke could be beneath his composed exterior. For all his power and presence, he carried loneliness like a second skin. The night grew colder, and they returned to the fortress. Lyra found herself thinking about his words, about the trust and courage it took for him to speak so openly. She also felt a strange connection, a pull toward someone who had known sorrow in ways she could barely imagine. Later, in the kitchens, Lyra was chopping herbs when she heard a soft whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the voice had a clarity that froze her blood. "Lyra," she turned swiftly, her heart pounding, but saw no one. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, moving almost of their own will. She gripped the counter, steadying herself. "Who's there?" she called softly. A quiet laugh answered, and Darian stepped from the doorway, his eyes reflecting the torchlight. "Do not be afraid," he said. "The shadows test all who enter these halls. You pass the first trial by staying calm." Lyra exhaled slowly, relief mingling with a strange thrill. I did not expect that," she admitted. Darian's gaze softened. "Few are brave enough to face them. Few are still with heart enough to remain." The words lingered, wrapping around her chest like a warm shawl. She realized she wanted to remain, not out of duty, but out of choice. Something in her wanted to see the Duke, the fortress, and even the shadows for what they truly were. Days later, a minor incident shook the fortress. One of the outer walls had been weakened by the recent storm, and the sentries found a gap where the wind had howled through. The shadows seemed to gather there, flickering unnaturally, whispering in the cold. Darian ordered repairs immediately, but he did not act alone. Lyra found herself assisting him, carrying materials and offering practical solutions. They worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, their movements synchronized as if instinctively aware of one another. "You are not like the others," Darian remarked, once again, his voice quiet. "You face things without hesitation, without fear. I admire that." Lyra flushed slightly. "I do not do it for admiration, my lord. I do it because it must be done." He studied her, and for a moment his usual composure slipped. "Perhaps that is enough." The next evening, as the castle fell silent, Lyra wandered through the halls, thinking about the Duke, the shadows, and the strange bond forming between them. The air was still, almost too still, and she felt a presence behind her. "Lyra," a whisper called, gentle but insistent. She turned, and Darian emerged from the darkness. "The shadows are restless tonight," he said, "but I think they sense something different here, something that does not belong to fear." Lyra's chest tightened. "And what is that?" "Trust," he replied simply. "And perhaps the beginnings of something more." For the first time, Lyra did not feel fear. She felt anticipation, curiosity, and a thrill she could not deny. She realized that the fortress, the shadows, and the Duke were all part of a world she wanted to be in, not just as a cook, but as someone who belonged. Yet the castle had its secrets, and the shadows were far from silent. Something waited in the halls, something that would soon challenge both their courage and their hearts. Lyra returned to her room that night, heart pounding, the moonlight casting long silver lines across the stone floor. She had chosen to stay. But she knew deep down that staying meant facing the unknown, and when the unknown arrived, there would be no choice but to meet it together. The first frost of winter had arrived in Erindor. Silver dusted the trees, and the fortress gleamed under a pale sun. Yet inside the walls of Darien Vailmont's fortress, warmth was rare, except in the kitchens where Lyra moved like a quiet flame. She had been in the fortress for weeks now, her presence no longer a novelty but a steady part of life. Still, she knew the shadows were never far. Darien had begun to trust her in ways he had not trusted anyone for years. He allowed her into his private chambers occasionally, showing her books and relics, and even the black-framed mirror that reflected past and future. Yet with each shared glance, each fleeting moment of connection, both felt the pull of something unspoken, something delicate and terrifying in its intensity. One morning, Lyra awoke to find a note slipped under her door. Written in Darien's familiar sharp handwriting, it read, "Meet me in the northern garden at dusk. There is something you must see." Lyra felt a flutter of nerves and excitement. She had learned to read the Duke's subtle cues, but this was different. He never invited anyone to witness the things he kept hidden. She prepared for the day as usual, moving efficiently through the kitchen. Yet her mind wandered, imagining what awaited her in the frost-laden garden. As dusk approached, she wrapped a thick cloak around herself and stepped into the gardens. The hedges were crystalline in the setting sun, and the air shimmered with frost. Darien stood near a fountain, its water frozen into delicate spikes that caught the last rays of sunlight. He did not speak at first, simply watching her approach. "Lyra," he said finally, his voice low and calm, "what I am about to show you is not for the faint of heart. It is part of my family's curse." Lyra's eyes widened. "I have faced shadows before, my lord. I am not afraid." He nodded. "This is more than shadows. This is the truth of what my family has carried for generations." He gestured to the frozen fountain. From beneath the ice, a faint glow shimmered like trapped fireflies. The light pulsed slowly, and Lyra realized it was not from the ice itself, but from something trapped beneath. Darien knelt beside it, his gloved hands brushing the surface. "Many years ago, my family angered forces older than the kingdom itself," he began. "A curse was placed upon us, binding sorrow and isolation to our bloodline. The stronger the fear, the stronger the curse. The shadows you have felt are part of it. They test hearts looking for weakness." Lyra's fingers tightened around the edge of her cloak. "And you have lived with this alone." He glanced at her, his eyes dark and haunted. "Alone, yes, until you arrived. You make the shadows hesitate. They sense something different, someone not afraid." Lyra's heart fluttered. "And what do you feel?" she asked softly. Darien did not answer immediately. He rose to his full height, his gaze fixed on her. "I feel hope, a dangerous kind of hope, one I have not felt in decades." For a long moment they stood in silence, the frozen garden holding its breath around them. Lyra felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had never met anyone who carried sorrow so openly yet demanded courage from those around him. Days passed, and the bond between them deepened, though unspoken tension simmered beneath every glance. Lyra began to notice changes, not in the Duke's behavior alone but in the fortress itself. Shadows seemed to linger longer, moving with intention. The air felt charged, almost electric. Something was stirring unseen, waiting for the perfect moment. One evening, while fetching fresh herbs from the cellar, Lyra discovered a hidden door she had never seen before. It was small, carved from ancient wood, and covered with runes that glowed faintly in the torchlight. Her curiosity overwhelmed caution. She opened it slowly and found a narrow spiral staircase leading downward. At the bottom, the air was damp and cold. The walls were lined with more runes, and in the center of the room was a stone pedestal, upon which rested a small black box. Lyra's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside was a single crystal, pulsing with light like a heartbeat. She knew instinctively that it was connected to the Duke's curse. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, startled, and found Darian standing in the doorway, his eyes wide but controlled. "You found it," he said quietly. "The heart of Urindor. It has been hidden for centuries. Only someone with courage and purity of heart can touch it without harm." Lyra looked at the crystal, then back at him. "Why show me this?" "Because," he said, stepping closer, "I trust you, and because I need your help." Lyra's heart raced. Helping him meant stepping fully into the world of shadows and curses that haunted his family. It meant risk, but also a chance to be part of something larger than herself, something that mattered. "I will help," she said firmly. Darian's expression softened, relief flickering across his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "You have no idea how much this means to me." The next night, they performed a small ritual in the hidden chamber. Darian chanted in a low, rhythmic voice, while Lyra followed his instructions, holding the crystal in both hands. The light from the heart of Urindor pulsed stronger and stronger, bathing the room in soft white radiance. Shadows flickered along the walls, writhing and twisting, as if trying to escape the light. Suddenly, a shadow darker than the rest lunged toward them. It moved like smoke but carried a weight of sorrow so deep it made Lyra's chest ache. She froze for a moment, but Darian's hand found hers, and his presence gave her strength. Together, they directed the crystal's light toward the shadow. The shadow screamed, not in sound but in pain, and slowly dissolved into the air. Lyra and Darian both collapsed to their knees, breathing heavily, hearts pounding. The chamber was still once more, except for the gentle glow of the crystal. Darian looked at her, his face a mixture of awe and something softer, more vulnerable. "You were incredible," he said. Lyra shook her head, breathless. "We did it together." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No," he whispered. "It was you. Your courage, your heart, you saved me." Her cheeks warmed. She wanted to speak, to say something that would capture the storm of feelings inside her, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply met his gaze, and in that moment, silence said more than words could. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. The crystal remained on the pedestal, its light steady but dimmer, as if the fortress itself was catching its breath. Yet the shadows were not gone entirely. They had retreated, but they waited, watching, testing. Lyra noticed Darian changing as well. He was calmer, less burdened by fear, but there was also a vulnerability he could not hide. He trusted her in ways he had trusted no one before, and she realized that the fortress, the curse, and even the shadows had become something they could face together. But the peace was not to last. One evening, while they walked through the garden again, the wind carried a whisper that chilled them both. It was a sound like ice cracking over still water, soft and low, yet unmistakable. "The shadows, they are not finished," Darian said, his jaw tightening. Lyra's hand found his and she squeezed it. "Then we will face them," she said firmly. "Together." Darian's gaze softened as he looked at her. "Yes, together," he murmured, the weight of centuries of sorrow in his eyes. And for the first time, Lyra saw hope there, bright and fragile, but unbroken. As night fell over the fortress, a distant glow appeared in the northern woods. Lyra and Darian exchanged a look, knowing that whatever waited there was neither shadow nor mere wind. Something more ancient, more powerful was stirring. Lyra's heart beat faster, not from fear but from the thrill of the unknown. She had chosen to stay, and now there was no turning back. The shadows would come again, testing them, pushing them to their limits. And through it all, the bond between them, trust, courage, and perhaps the beginnings of something more, would be their only guide. They returned to the hidden chamber, the crystal glowing softly between them. Neither spoke of what might come next, but both knew it would arrive soon. The fortress held its breath once more, and in the quiet, Lyra felt the truth of her own choice. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to trust. and she had chosen to step into a world where the heart could be both fragile and powerful, where love and courage could shine even in the darkest shadow. The northern woods glowed under the pale light of the crescent moon. A mist curled among the frost-covered trees, twisting like fingers of smoke. Lyra stood at the edge of the forest, her cloak pulled tightly around her. Beside her, Darian's hand found hers, steady and warm. Neither spoke, but their shared breath, visible in the cold air, carried an unspoken resolve. The glow in the woods pulsed, brighter and stronger with every step. It was not the soft, comforting light of the crystal in the hidden chamber. This was something alive, something ancient, something that had waited for them. Lyra's heart raced, not with fear but with the thrill of what lay ahead. "This is it," Darian said quietly. "Whatever waits here, it will test us, not just our courage but our hearts." Lyra squeezed his hand. "Then we face it together." Together, they stepped into the mist. The glow led them deeper into the woods, where the frost sparkled like countless diamonds. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, flickering and whispering. They could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on them, the remnants of a curse that had haunted Darian's family for generations. At the heart of the woods, they found a clearing. The ground was bare, as if life itself had fled. In the center floated a sphere of light, larger than the crystal they had used before. It pulsed with energy, casting long, dancing shadows across the trees. Lyra instinctively stepped closer, sensing that this was the heart of the curse. Darian's eyes darkened with resolve. "This is the source. It is alive because of fear, sorrow, and isolation. We must confront it together." Lyra nodded. She placed the crystal from the hidden chamber on the ground. Its light joined with the glow of the sphere, intertwining in a dance of silver and gold. The shadows recoiled, hissing softly, as if sensing their defiance. "Take my hand," Darian said. Lyra did. The warmth of his grip steadied her as he began to chant softly, words that seemed older than the trees themselves. She repeated after him, her voice trembling at first, then growing stronger. The glow of the sphere pulsed faster, responding to the courage in their hearts. Suddenly, the shadows surged. They swirled around them, rising like a wave, whispering regrets, fears, and memories. Lyra saw glimpses of the Duke's past, losses, mistakes, and the loneliness that had shaped him. She also felt the shadows testing her, probing for weakness, for fear. She did not falter. She tightened her grip on Darian's hand and focused on the light within her, on the courage that had brought her here. Together, they let the light from the crystal and the strength of their hearts flow into the sphere. The shadows shrieked and writhed, but they could not withstand the combined force of trust, hope, and courage. Hours seemed to pass in silence and chaos, until finally, the sphere pulsed one last time and dissolved, leaving the clearing bathed in a calm, silver light. The shadows scattered, retreating into the woods, harmless and silent. Darian sank to his knees, exhaustion and relief in his eyes. Lyra knelt beside him. "We did it," she whispered. He shook his head slowly, a faint smile breaking across his face. "No, Lyra, you did it. Your courage, your heart, saved more than me. It saved this place, this family, and me." Lyra's chest tightened at his words. She had known she wanted to stay, to face the unknown with him, but hearing it aloud made the moment feel heavier, yet brighter. Darian reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I should have never doubted that someone could stand by me, someone could care for me as you have." Lyra looked into his eyes, seeing the pain of the past, but also hope for the future. "You don't have to carry it all alone anymore," she said softly. "Not when I'm here." For a long moment the wind whispered through the trees, carrying their words into the night. And then, in the quiet aftermath, something shifted between them. A warmth replaced the cold that had clung to the fortress and its master for generations. The curse had been broken, not by force, but by courage, trust, and connection. As they rose, Darian looked at her with a vulnerability he had never shown anyone. "Lyra, I know you said you might leave at dawn, but I can no longer imagine this life without you. Please stay with me." Lyra's lips curved into a gentle smile. I will stay," she said, "not because you ask, but because I choose to. And perhaps, until the next dawn, I will never want to leave." He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Then we begin again," he whispered, "not as Duke and Cook, but as two hearts who chose to face the darkness together." The forest around them seemed to breathe with relief. Shadows that had haunted generations were gone, leaving only the silver light of a new beginning. Lyra felt the weight of her fears lift, replaced by the warmth of purpose and belonging. She had found more than courage in the Duke's fortress. She had found connection, trust, and a love that was patient, steady, and real. Days passed, and the fortress changed as well. The halls no longer felt heavy with sorrow. Torches burned brighter, laughter returned to the kitchens, and the shadows no longer whispered warnings. The staff noticed a new energy in the Duke. He smiled more often, walked taller, and no longer carried the burden of isolation. And Lyra, she moved through the halls with quiet confidence, her presence a light of its own. One morning, as dawn broke over the frost-covered plains, Lyra stood at her window looking out over the kingdom. Darien appeared beside her, wrapping his cloak around her shoulders. "The dawn is brighter now," he said softly. She leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace. "Yes," she whispered, "and it feels like home." Darien's eyes softened as he looked down at her. "Lyra, stay, not for the fortress, not for me as Duke, but for us. For what we have built together." She smiled, her heart full. "I will stay, because it is here with you that I belong." For the first time in decades, Darien felt light. The curse of his family no longer held him, and the shadows that had haunted him were gone. He had faced the darkness, and in doing so had found someone who could stand beside him. Not as a servant, not as a fleeting presence, but as an equal, a companion, and perhaps the beginning of something eternal. Together, they watched the sun rise over Erendor, painting the world in shades of gold and silver. The frost glimmered, and the wind carried a gentle promise that no shadow, no curse, and no sorrow could ever break the bond they had forged. Lyra turned to Darien, her eyes shining with hope. "Whatever comes next," she said, "we face it together." Darien nodded, holding her hand tightly. "Together," he agreed, his voice steady and sure. And in the quiet of the dawn, with the fortress bathed in light for the first time in generations, they both knew that this was not an ending, it was a beginning. The darkness had been faced, courage had prevailed, and love had grown where fear once held sway. The world of Erendor seemed vast, full of possibilities, yet nothing felt as important as the warmth of their hands, the trust in their hearts, and the promise of the mornings yet to come.